Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Ruth Vanita, Director of South and Southeast Asian Studies and of Global Humanities and Religions. Global Humanities and Religions is the new and improved version of liberal studies. We are grateful to the School of Journalism for their generous support of this event. And after the lecture and discussion, please join us for a reception in LA 138, which is just down the hall down here. I'd also like to thank the American Association of University Women for supporting the reception. And we're grateful to Missoula Community Access Television for recording today's presentation as part of a media assistance grant that they are donating to our program. For more information on them, they said visit mcap.org. I'd like to thank Gigi Wykes and Jessica Skipper for their help in organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to introduce Suzanne Goldenberg, who is a renowned journalist. Ms. Goldenberg worked with The Guardian for over 2 decades, and she was based in India for many years, which is where I first met her. She has won several awards for her reporting from the Middle East, and she has reported from several war zones, including Chechnya, Georgia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Following her work in Asia, she was The Guardian's US environment correspondent, reporting from Washington, where she is now based. She's the author of 2 books, Pride of Small Nations, The Caucasus and Post-Soviet Disorder, and Madam President, Is America Ready to Send Hillary Clinton to the White House, which focused on Hillary Clinton's historic first run for the presidency. So please help me to welcome Ms. Goldenberg.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vanita, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, too, to the South and Southeast Asian Studies Department and the School of Journalism for bringing me here today. It's great to be in Montana again. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. I'm lucky to have visited Montana before and Missoula in 2006. I was here for the Society of Environmental Journalism Conference, which was great because we were able to get out and to explore the Blackfoot Valley and to have a look at what was happening on the ground here. We saw pine beetle forest sort of ravaged by pine beetle. We saw wolf conservation efforts. We met grizzly experts, and it was really a tremendous trip. And for me, also, as a Washington-based journalist, it was just about as far as you could go and get away from a typical day as a reporter in Washington, where the most sort of contact with wildlife would be chasing some congressman down a corridor in Congress or fighting your way onto a crowded Red Line train. So that was just a wonderful trip, and I really have fond memories of my time here. And so now I'm going to do an abrupt and wrenching pivot from those very fond memories, warm and positive memories, to an existential threat on a planetary scale, which is, of course, climate change. And what I want to talk about today here is the effects of climate change on India and the US, which are the world's 2 largest big democracies, India in terms of population, and how these 2 countries, which are accountable to their voters, are dealing with this real threat to their economy and to human survival. So this picture here is from New Orleans in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. And I would argue that this was the moment that really forced many Americans to face up to the fact that even in extremely developed industrialized societies and rich countries, that humans are really vulnerable in the face of natural systems. And what I mean by this is that if you live in a city, as most Americans do, and you live in a big city, you generally don't see any risk in your environment. If it snows, you have a snow day. If it rains, you stay indoors. If it's too hot, you turn on the air conditioner And all these systems that we built up around us, the built environment helps protect us from these elements. And they just function as you plan, as they were meant to. But Katrina really changed that for urban planners and for some people. For a time. I mean, I don't think Katrina changed the way we look at disaster and the way we looked at climate change forever. A few years after this, in 2008, I was sent as a reporter to cover the next, what was expected to be the next big hurricane. That was Hurricane Gustave in 2008. And I remember that one, the eye of that hurricane was in Baton Rouge, so just up from the coast. And I remember going there and driving actually I was in Lafayette, forgive me, and driving along this small country road, and I saw people who were just hunkering down in these small little roadside bars to wait out the hurricane. These were places without shelter, belt of wood, no foundation. It could be blown away, just by a puff of wind. And still, they were under evacuation order, and nobody thought that they had to go anywhere. So people are really blasé still in the face of very real dangers, even a few years after, something as devastating as Katrina. Oops, and when we did this earlier, the clicker did succeed. Yes. So what I'm really hoping to do today with this little talk is just to get across three very simple points. One is that, and I'm sorry for many of you who are steeped in the issue of climate change, but I think we have to repeat it, is that climate change is real. Its effects are unfolding in real time in highly developed industrialized countries and in developing countries. It is caused by humans. It is caused by fossil fuel emissions. And it is causing real damage to the economy. Its primary victims in rich and poor countries are the least powerful in both those societies: women, children, the poor, the elderly, the disabled. Which brings me to my second main point. Climate change is real. Two, that means for me, climate change is a story about human rights, and it's a human story. Its effects are amplified or reduced by the way we, as humans, engineer our physical environment or manage our society. If we build too much inequality into our society, there will be more victims of climate change. If we fail to build up the physical environment or do the other kind of adaptation that is required to deal with rising seas, droughts, heat waves, or these other impacts of climate change, we will also feel the greater impacts of climate change. I think in particular we're now just beginning to see an awareness among planners and NGOs that climate change and and the disasters that occur because of climate change, things like migration, drought, disproportionately affect women, and I'll be talking to that today. And they disproportionately affect women because they have an unequal economic and social status in society. So climate change, human issue, but it's also a women's rights issue. And I wish I had a better clicker, sorry. And here, I'm showing you George Bush looking out at the window from an aircraft just after Katrina. Now, if you remembered when George Bush started as president, one of the first things that he did early on was to take the US out of the Kyoto Climate Accords. And it was seen as that George Bush was hostile to any action on climate change. But this trip was in August or September 2005. And if you look at his State of the Union address in January 2006, George Bush talked about more funding for renewable energy projects. He announced a 20% increase in clean energy research at the Department of Energy into things like clean coal and solar and wind, as well as technology. Which brings me to the third point, which is that even people that you think are not engaged on the issue of climate change, that may say that they don't think climate change is real or occurring as a threat, governments, major financial institutions, businesses, do see climate change as a real problem and are actively engaged in trying to deal with it, whether to reduce emissions that cause climate change or to engineer a way to protect people from climate change. And I'm bringing this up specifically because I know, living in Washington, where I talk to the sort of big green groups, there are a lot of organizations that are in despair following the election of Donald Trump, who fear that he's going to dismantle environmental protections and pull the US out of the Paris Climate Treaty. And I want to make it clear that despite what the current administration's policies might be on climate change, that there are other actors out there who are acting to mitigate the effects of climate change. And I think one real reason that that continues and that climate change does continue to occupy the concerns and concerned policymakers is that it is very real and that we really don't have any choice. One thing we've learned about climate change and the risk of climate change is that there are always new ones coming up. So this shows a mother in Brazil with twins. These babies you can see are not healthy. These kids were born and were affected with the Zika virus. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, who would have thought that this was linked to climate change? But we've learned that this virus spreads more rapidly in conditions that are influenced by climate change. In Brazil, in particular, you had higher temperatures and a drought that increased the spread of the Zika virus. Now I'm going back to some basics now about climate. And I don't know if anyone here recognizes these gentlemen, who they might be. Okay, so the person on the left is Joseph Fourier, who was a French scientist, and the man on the right is John Tyndall, a British scientist. Fourier did his best work in the 1820s, Tyndall in the 1840s. And what their work really did was to lay the foundations of our understanding about about the Earth's atmosphere, was Fourier's great work, and about the effects of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere. So my point here that I'm trying to make is that climate change isn't new. It's been building on the foundations and the work done by other scientists over the last 200 years. There is now an established and abundant body of evidence and of scientific work about climate change and the human element of climate change, that it is indeed caused by humans, that we are the main driver of climate change. And so we know climate change, it's not new, it's not in any doubt, and it's caused by rising amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This isn't a surprise to any serious scientist. So since about the mid to late 1800s, when the industrial age began, the world has warmed by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit because of the burning of fossil fuels for energy and for transportation. There's now multiple lines of evidence to show that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are the highest they've been for millions of years. That they are driving global warming. If you look at graphs since the late 1970s, you can clearly see a sharp uptick in the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's what's causing the changes in our current weather patterns and that we've been seeing in the extreme events. Some of those I'll just run through. Last year was the hottest year since meteorologists began keeping records in the 1880s. It was actually the third record-breaking year in a row when it comes to heat extremes, and that means that 16 of the 17 hottest years on record have all been recorded since the year 2000, according to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a US government scientific agency. And if you think that's just a blip, I'd remind you that we haven't seen a record cold year since 2011. NOAA today released their monthly climate data for January 2017, and what that showed is that the Arctic and Antarctic sea ice extent were at their lowest on record. Those records don't go back as far. They go back to 1981. In terms of temperature, once again, the January land temperature was 2.77 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average. It was the third warmest January last month, the third warmest that we've seen in 137 years. That's the global land temperature. And the first and second warmest temperatures that we've seen in January globally were in 2016 and 2007. So my talk is about India and the US, and I'm going to sort of move to what these changes that we're now seeing globally mean for a country like India. Now, India, like the US, is considered part of the big emitters club. It's already one of the biggest contributors of climate change, and it will become even bigger as the population grows and as its economy grows. But India is also going to be really badly affected by climate change because of its geography, because of the economic and income levels and the social conditions. The problem here is that for a country like India is that how does it deal with climate change at the same time as it's trying to develop its economy? It's a very difficult problem for a country like India. India faces acute energy shortages. And it needs that energy to grow the economy and lift people out of poverty. When I was living in India, there was no such thing as 24-hour electricity from the municipal electricity supplier. The electricity would go on would go off, say, for 4 to 6 hours a day. You only were able to run your appliances if you were a person who could afford it, like me, is you'd have a big sort of car battery set up that you called an inverter, and you couldn't run an air conditioner off it, but you could run sort of a basic number of appliances off that. Other people rely on generators. So you've got this country trying to move up into, as a rapidly emerging economy on the global stage that still cannot assure constant power supply to residential customers or to the industrial customers that it needs to grow their economy. And of course, in rural areas, there's no electricity at all. India has perhaps a population of 1.2 billion, and it is believed that 300 million people in rural areas don't have access to any electricity. And that in itself is probably an underestimate if you think about the way you use electricity in your life. There's probably a large slice of the population that might have access to a light bulb or one light bulb in their house, or a very limited way, not the full range of being able to flip on a switch, whatever you like, fire up your fridge, run a computer, run your air conditioning. So there's a lot of pressure on the government of India first to give access to energy to all of its population in order to grow the economy before it deals with climate change, even though it's an increasingly large contributor to climate change, and even though its government knows that Indians are going to be hurt badly by climate change. So it's quite a complicated issue there. So one of the big impacts for India, this is actually not anywhere in Montana or in Alaska. This is in the high glaciers in the high Himalayas. One of the big issues for India is going to be glacier melt. There's about 900 million people, it is believed, who will be affected by this sort of changing pattern of melt in the glaciers. In terms of agriculture across the great northern part of India, the breadbasket of India. There's also going to be, when those glaciers melt, it's not going to be done at a small and orderly place. You're going to have big chunks of ice crashing off. There's, sometimes the glaciers form lakes, sometimes the embankments of those lakes just go, and that their villages wash down underneath. So there's all sorts of issues looming when the glaciers change. The most immediate, I think, is the issue of drought and drought and monsoon. Most of India's agriculture remains dependent on the monsoon and monsoon patterns. So what happens when the rains don't come and when there is a drought is that food production, agricultural production, goes way down. Last summer, for example, there were about 250 districts across 10 states. And I forget, are there 27 states in India now? 20? They keep making more states, but so I can't remember. I'm sorry. But about 20-something states in India that were affected by failure of the monsoons. The monsoon rains come sort of June, July, and that really is what nourishes the crops. So that's about 330 million people in rural areas. It was one of the worst droughts ever in India's recent history, and it cost the economy about $100 billion. And it had huge toll on human beings. India is still, urbanization is growing, but India is still a largely rural population. 70% of the population is still dependent in some way on agriculture, forestry, livestock farming, and fisheries. And in rural areas in particular, a lot of this activity is carried out by women. So the men might go, when a drought happens, the men might go off and look for work as a day laborer, but the woman is still staying home working that small plot of land, trying to get that plot of land going. And if a woman is forced to migrate or to the city, she has fewer options because of social attitudes in terms of looking for work, fewer say over over decision making in the households. These economic hardships just compound existing inequalities. And the thing about drought is that I don't think people recognize is that a drought, even when it rains again, what happened in the drought isn't immediately erased. When a drought happens, people go into debt, to tide themselves over. They don't just bounce back the next year when it rains, and they don't just bounce back if they've had to go off to a slum area to get some work. And the soil doesn't bounce back. The soil becomes increasingly degraded, it becomes overused, so it's hard to get the same kind of crop and same kind of income that you got before those really punishing droughts. India, if you remember the shape, a V, has lots of coastline. And like other countries, it's affected by global sea level rise. And there's a lot of important infrastructure along those coastlines. Things from rocket launch systems to big cities to hotels, a lot of valuable real estate in harm's way. One other sort of big thing that is happening for India in climate change is that it's increased the cost of natural disasters. This is from Uttarakhand, which is in northern India, the foothills of the Himalayas. And it's a relatively small state. But this is, I think, from 2013. There were heavy rains, intense floodings. Many of these buildings were damaged and collapsed. They hadn't been built to code. They hadn't been built to withstand this kind of heavy and punishing rainfall. What happens when you've also in hilly areas like here, you have mudslides coming with these heavy rains that come with climate change. This is in Kashmir, which is one Muslim majority state in India, and which has had an insurgency running for decades. And so I think I'll leave it to you to imagine what happens when you have natural disaster, economic loss, and an insurgency. It's a recipe for further trouble. The other sort of real impacts that India is grappling with have to do with its neighboring countries. Bangladesh is even more low-lying than India in many ways. It's the textbook for disaster and climate change because it is so much of the country is low-lying. But what has happened, is that when Bangladesh is sort of gets eaten up by sea level rise, by extreme storms, then you have people coming across the border, economic migrants coming into India. It puts increasing pressure on Indian government resources and scarce resources to deal with that. Those are some of the things that we've seen over the last few years. This picture is actually different. This is these people are Rohingya Muslims from Burma who are, have no rights and have been kicked out of Burma and then were kicked into Bangladesh and now are sort of making their way across to India. So you have people who are suffering from sort of ethnic inequality and climate change and just everybody on the move there. So we know what causes climate change. It's human emissions. We see some of the impacts. But how do we can't really stop it unless we can get at the actors who are causing these emissions. And that is a sort of crux of global efforts to deal with climate change. If you just look here at this map, the blue bars include changing, which are slightly higher, include changing land use patterns. That means, when you cut down a forest and trees conserve carbon, when you cut down a forest and turn it over to agriculture, you actually are releasing more carbon into the air. So you can see by this metric that India is fourth in terms of the global big emitters. And that's if you consider the 28 countries of the European Union as one whole. If you take them apart, then India comes in number 3 in the big emitters club. But as you can also see, it's a fraction of what China emits and what the United States emits. As you can see from this, currently, China is the biggest single contributor to climate change, followed by the United States, followed by the EU, and then quite far behind is India. But if you look at it historically, you'll see that the United States, is in blue here, is 27% of the climate pollution that is already baked into the atmosphere. That was caused by the United States. And if you look where India is there, it's at 3%, right? So most of the effects of climate change that we're seeing now are built into the system and were caused by the industrialization patterns of the United States and Europe. We're looking at 52%. So you could argue, if you want to deal with climate change, let's just make the US and Europe cut emissions. But it's not so simple. Because if you look at what's been happening since 1990, you see that the US is sort of slipping behind. And there you see that the developing world coming up. And so if you're going to deal with climate change, difficult as it is for a country like India, and it's challenging for a country like India, you have to get India to reduce its emissions going forward, reduce the rate of emissions growth going forward, or there's no point. Anything will be ineffective. But it is a very different challenge for both countries, because the US, rich with a developed economy and a high standard of living, has a per capita GDP of $53,000 a year. It's got abundant fossil fuel reserves. It's got coal in Appalachia and right here. And it's got natural gas, a booming natural gas, and it's got access to technology. India, on the other hand, is a developing economy, and while it's now plugged increasingly into the global economy, its per capita income is about $5,350. And India's ability to grow its economy is held back by those energy shortages. So I would argue that in some ways, it's a really, really big ask, what's happening in this sort of global negotiations. To ask India to do its share for climate change is very difficult for India. And I would just like people to keep that in mind, because very often what we hear here is that the US is doing everything on climate and nobody else is doing anything. But, India is developing its economy, and it's a dirty business. So this actually shows an oil spill. But 70% of India's electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. And coal is the dirtiest source of electricity. 17% comes from hydro, which cause large dams, which create political problems and environmental problems. And so that leaves about 10% only currently that India is getting from renewals. And its population wants to grow. That's they want air conditioners and modern appliances that other countries have, that people have. And but as India is growing, the question is India replicating the same mistakes that the Western countries made in terms of investing too heavily into fossil fuel? I mean, for example, with prosperity in India, you get more and more use of cars, more cars from emissions, more traffic jams. You get building patterns that encourage the spread of cars and urban sprawl. And here I'd say, what is here is where climate change again meets human decisions. I mean, India is actually increasing its contribution to climate change from the decisions it's making about transport. It has invested in a metro, but it's put a lot of money into building big fancy flyovers in Delhi and in building outwards rather than upwards, which would reduce the use of cars. Here you should be able to see it, but you can't. You see one of the this is one of the grand colonial era buildings in India, at the heart of India. And you can't see it because of the smog from those vehicles. And so, that India, as it's developed, in Indian cities now are outranking, that's India Gate. India now is outranking China in terms of poor air quality in cities. And air quality is another casualty of climate change. It's increasingly, the air in our cities is affected by higher temperatures. It becomes harder to breathe the air. The other sort of chaos that we're seeing in Indian cities with respect to climate change is they're just not built taking into account of the heavy rains and the other changes that we're going to see going forward. This is Bombay in a monsoon. So how is India sort of dealing with this situation? Well, in May 2014, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi sort of made universal access to electricity part of his administration's ambitions. He also committed to help lead the effort to get global action on climate change. And he offered some really ambitious plans. He wanted to increase India's renewable energy capacity to 175 gigawatts, including about 100 gigawatts of solar power by 2022. And just to give you a scale of how much that is, that's about Germany's entire electrical generation supply. That's a huge amount of solar panels. So in terms of renewables, they were about 10% of India's power supply. The plans, they're now talking about tripling that to close to 30%. These are very, very ambitious plans. But, I mean, to be clear, India at the same time is also increasing its reliance on coal. It currently uses about 800 million tons of coal a year. Remember, coal is the dirtiest fuel. And it could double its use of coal by 2035, including the World Energy Council. So it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or as far as those things go. Now, the U.S. over recent years, has been having its own sort of climate journey. And it started again with a storm. And in this case, that storm was Sandy. If you'll remember, when Barack Obama was elected and came to power in 2009, his big promise was to act on climate change. I covered that campaign, and at every campaign stop, he said, our country, our planet is in peril, our country is at war, was this sort of a mantra. But he was unable to do anything through Congress to fight climate change. And in fact, the administration, as you covered it, as a journalist, I covered it, they just stopped talking about climate change because anytime it became a lightning rod, and it became a highly politicized issue. And whenever they talked about climate change, they would get pushback from Republicans. So they began to talk about green jobs or clean energy opportunities. And the words climate change were barely mentioned going into 2012, and certainly not in the election until Superstorm Sandy, which was in late October. That storm, caused about $65 billion in damage, and it killed about 160 people. And it damaged and it destroyed about 650,000 homes. So it became clear to Obama that you couldn't ignore climate change anymore, despite the sort of political risks. And there was pressure on him from other political actors, like famously New York's Michael Bloomberg. But so he, and here are some of the impacts that we saw then. I mean, if you remember those pictures then. That I think was the image that sort of really startled most people, that New York City without lights for days. That's more than 8.5 million people lost power. And so he began to work and to sort of put climate change on his agenda. At the same time as that was happening politically, you have begun to see more and more impacts of climate change around the U.S. Not as big as Sandy, but still dramatic. That's South Florida. And what you're seeing now in low-lying places in Florida, which is, the Florida coastline is eroding and sinking at the same time as the seas are rising. So it's higher, much higher than the global average in terms of sea level rise. So you're now seeing things that they call nuisance floods on a regular basis. I was there in July, and it rained heavily, but for 15 minutes, and the streets were flooded. I think I was in Fort Lauderdale. I mean, it's quite striking. So a lot of property there is at risk. Mar-a-Lago, for example, which is Donald Trump's winter White House, the projections show that by the mid-century, that portions of his property are going to be underwater up to 210 days a year. You now have people, when they buy and sell a house in Florida, when they go for an inspection, they'll also get a flood risk analysis done to see, how much underwater their home is going to be in 2020, 2050. It's a way of life. You're seeing farmers and the USDA now beginning to worry about corn productivity. It's the biggest cash crop. It's a huge cash crop for many farmers, but corn is a crop that is really finicky when it comes to heat stress. It becomes sterile if it gets too hot. And the nutritional quality also goes down. So that's, a direct threat at the most lucrative crop for many farmers. This is from the area in the Central Valley in California, where of course there was a big drought for 6 years with increased risk of wildfire and punishing sort of heat waves. And this is from a town towards the south of the valley called Porterville. And there's been so much pumping of groundwater to try and deal with the lack of rain that the land is actually sunk, and all the wells have gone dry. People's residential wells have gone dry. And that town, they're getting water by tanker. Not this year, but for several years before it's grown. You're getting huge amounts of casualties in terms of trees. The accumulative effects about drought in California means, I think the U.S. Forest Service said that they lost 102 million trees in California because of 6 years of drought, and 62 million just in the last year alone. And in Colorado, and certainly here, you've got increased vulnerability to pests, such as pine beetle. I was looking at one study that said 80% of mature lodgepole pine across the Williams Range, a large swath of the Williams Range in Colorado, was now looking like that. In other parts of the country, meanwhile, you're seeing tremendously wild weather. That's tremendous snow where you've never seen before. And in parts of the country, like Alaska, you're seeing freakishly warm winters, 50 degrees Fahrenheit above. That's that should be the route of the Iditarod, which is the sort of legendary 1,000-mile dog sled race. And last year, I mean, they ended up, in the past couple of years, they've had to bring in snow by train so that the dogs can start. And sometimes they shift the sort of starting point from Anchorage to Fairbanks. So, and so I think this is Atlantic City. It's a casino that was hit in the hurricane. So I think, Obama, when after Superstorm Sandy, when all these things were going on, he sort of was forced to confront what people who deal with climate change confront all the time, which is it becomes an issue of risks and how much risk you're willing to absorb and to take, and how you protect your population against risk. So Obama in 2013 was when he really began to move on climate change. He issued an executive order directing the EPA to issue the first rules affecting power plants and to sort of cut greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And that's been the sort of centerpiece of all the different items on his climate agenda that had begun to look. They were, without Congress, they were looking at various ways that they could rein in the U.S. emissions curve. That's actually Obama on holiday, but he became sort of really focused on climate change in the final 3 years, and certainly in the last year. Even when the election was going on, and even after Clinton had lost the election, his administration was busy putting out sort of climate action. I think there was one time, I think in 2016, where it was like one climate initiative every 4 days. It was an incredible sort of pace of action. And of course, you did get a lot of pushback against that from industry and from conservatives in Congress. And you got a lot of, some of that pushback came, I don't know how that got there. Some of that pushback came in the form of, attacking the science behind climate change. And some of the impact came in saying it would be too expensive to deal with climate change. But you also saw a real mobilization of the public for action on climate change, increasingly in 2014 and 15. This was the big demonstration in New York in September 2014. And I think that was something that sort of, like Superstorm Sandy, gave Obama cover and allowed him to sort of begin pushing on this thing that was politically contentious. So I think what happened is you had India, for its own reasons, beginning to deal more with climate change. You had the US dealing with climate change, and you had other countries on similar journeys. And they all sort of came together at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. And this was the first time that so many governments had got together and agreed to take collective action to fight climate change. And they set these goals of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 Fahrenheit, and really to aim to bring it down even lower to 1.5 Celsius, because some countries are vulnerable even to a smaller rise in temperature. And they also agreed to continue cutting emissions sort of going forward. So that marked a big, big watershed moment globally, because it was the first time that countries like India, countries like China, agreed that they would alter their course of development and take a less polluting path of growth in order to deal with climate change. Had the US acted on its own, it wouldn't have worked. Had India acted on its own, it wouldn't have worked. So you getting all these countries together and to agree was very, very important. So, and I think, why they did it was really, they recognized that in the end it was in their economic interests and in the interests of the people to act. Now, is it enough? It's not going to be enough what was done in Paris. The agreement at Paris is still going to leave a 12 billion ton shortfall, in terms of carbon emissions, which is about the annual emissions of the European Union. We're already so we're locked on a path, even if all countries live up to their pledges of Paris, we're locked on a path of 3 degrees Celsius. And that, and it's not clear that countries are going to be able to deliver. For countries like India, who's going to pay for that monumental transformation of its economy? It wants to keep putting in coal plants, even as it has ambitious plans for solar. And that is a big question. There's a big question about how we protect the most vulnerable from climate change. Economists and planners have noted that very little of the disaster planning that is done now on climate change factors gender into account. For example, one statistic that really struck me was from the Global Environment Facility, which is part of the World Bank, and that when you're talking about the projects that are being put forward generally to deal with climate change, in 2014, only 18% addressed gender. So they were all geared to men. But the other big problem was this agreement came into force. It was agreed, it came into force on November 4th of this year, and then on November 8th, we had elections in this country, and Obama leaves office, and we have a president who has said that climate change is a hoax, and who has said that he will pull out of the climate agreement and that he will roll back environmental regulations. He's made appointments, to government agencies of, such as Scott Pruitt at the EPA, who has sued the EPA 14 times. He's appointed Perry to the Department of Energy, who has said he wants to dismantle the Department of Energy. There's a bill that's been introduced in the House to dismantle the EPA. There's a freeze on jobs and programs and spending at the EPA that could sort of that could really limit their ability to do anything. And there you have Donald Trump, who just today was signing a bill that would that was voted on by Congress last week, that would allow coal companies to once again dump refuge in streams. And he was reaffirming his promise to the coal mining companies that he would sort of bring the coal jobs back. So I guess the question is, despite these efforts that are being made by the US and India today, up to date, are we done for when it comes to dealing with climate change? Does everything sort of fall away with the change of government? And I would say, I would stay still not. First of all, I think it's worth watching, but we're seeing that world leaders have been approaching Trump and talking to Trump about the Paris Agreement and about the importance of keeping the Paris Agreement. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, supports the Paris Agreement. Many big corporations have told him to stick with the Paris Agreement. Companies like Monsanto, it's not just, Ben & Jerry's ice cream or the sort of lefty, groovy companies. There's a lot of corporate America that is for staying in the Paris Agreement. Then, you're talking about the Clean Power Plant rules. That's the sort of centerpiece of the U.S. Climate Action Plan. What's going to happen to those? And that is still before the courts. We don't know. But I would argue that there's been a large number of states that have actually been moving into the direction mandated by the Clean Power Plants. Their emissions have been going down anyway, and a lot of states are moving from coal and towards gas. As a case in point, The utilities that own the Navajo generating station outside Arizona this week agreed to decommission the plant ahead of schedule. That's the biggest coal plant in the West that's going out ahead of schedule because it's just cheaper to use natural gas. So I think market forces are going to continue to clean up America's energy supply. And I think, that we are going to continue to see India going down the path of solar energy. For one, it's easier and cheaper to install distributed solar. There's financing, some financing available for distributed solar. And there is also growing recognition that it's of international institutions as well as foundations that it's important to deal with gender and climate change. There's big initiatives about cook stoves, getting clean cook stoves there so that people aren't polluting when they, cook dinner. So I think that business is moving in that direction. And I think also, so this shows, one of the sort of centerpieces of this sort of new clean energy economy, which would be the Tesla, right? And Elon Musk seems to be talking regularly to Trump, but I would want to sort of impress on you that I think that private industry is also moving in that direction. You've seen a big growth in electric vehicles in the US and China and Japan last year. And it just, despite the rhetoric, I would say that this car and clean energy is our future. Trump is always talking about saving coal jobs. But I would ask you, how many jobs were there created in the U.S. last year, created by the solar industry? Anybody want to hazard a guess? 51,000 jobs. So there are jobs coming with the clean energy economy, and they're coming across the country. So I thought I would leave it at that, just to sort of bring home the point that climate change is occurring. It's occurring in real time. It's occurring at a pace that really forces humans to rethink our economic system, our system, the inequalities in our system, the way we deal with our built environment, the way we deal with our society. And that is a big challenge. And for democracies like the US, like India, it also is a challenge. These countries have to be accountable to voters and what voters want and the public response. So I think these are all things that are in play going forward. And for those reasons, I do believe that even in the current atmosphere and climate, that you are going to see progress continued to some degree on climate change. The only question for me in this country is, how fast and whether it'll be enough. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, for that enlightening talk. And now we go to take questions.
Sure.
You had mentioned earlier when we were talking about India in particular that there were concerned that their habits and the way that they're developing, how people want to be more like the West in terms of, like you had used the example of air conditioning. Do you think that it's important for countries like us to put forth efforts, since we are like the second biggest player in climate change? Do you think it's more important for us to focus on what we're doing and what we can do to fix that, or is it more important to help these countries that are developing into what can become a larger player in climate change? Do you think we should put more effort into local or coordinate?
I think it's got to be both. On the air conditioning, there's actually another sort of plus point, in that there was an agreement, a global agreement concluded last year that will, separate from the Paris Agreement, but to deal with the cooling agent in air conditioning, which actually is which is a climate super polluter. It's in small quantities, but it's much more bang for the buck in terms of causing warming. So India was reluctant, but India did agree to switch over to these different cooling systems, which were developed together, Honeywell, the technology. So, and that could take off half a degree. So that is that kind of example where there, that coordination, that technology, that transfer of technology is crucial. And that doesn't have to take the form of public aid, of public money and aid. And in fact, it's acknowledged that it won't. That more and more that has to be sort of investment. And that has to be opportunities where companies can make a profit. It's not going to be a handout. India is not expecting a handout. But they're expecting, efforts to build their capacity. They want to welcome investment as well. And there are, of course, other countries that are not big contributors to climate change. In Africa, especially, where their emissions are nil, but are going to be growing more in the 21st century, but will be needing much more in the way of foreign aid to deal with impacts. So it's a both. So, I'm not sure who put up the hand, but I'll go with you.
From a systemic perspective, how important do you think is that markets sort of price on pollution?
A price on carbon?
Yeah, and just other pollutions.
I mean, I think it's sort of acknowledged as hugely important, and I don't know if you saw, if it was this week or last week, you had a sort of delegation of eminent Republicans, James Baker, George Shultz, go to see Donald Trump and sort of say, look, you've got to put a price on carbon. So in economic circles and the level of financial institutions, you've got big support internationally for putting a price on carbon. The Canadian government is behind it, the British government is behind it, the US government was behind it. So there is more and more consensus to that, because the argument is that there is a social cost, or is a public cost to using fossil fuel energy, and that should be reflected in the market.
What is the biggest push for coal in India? I know it's available.
Right.
Is it the labor thing, or is it certain states that are pushing it? Because I don't think they have a great access to natural gas, and they don't have a great grid yet for solar.
There's just a tremendous demand for energy. There's tremendous shortages of energy. They have the coal. The coal is poor quality. It's not as good as, it's brown coal, I think. But it's dirty coal. But it's there. It's at home. They don't have to spend foreign currency. And they need, they need the electricity. The gentleman.
Prior to the recession, there was a pretty vibrant market, worldwide market for carbon credits. Do you see that coming back? In the U.S., California had its own program. There's a Chicago Exchange. There's one going on in Europe where people were buying and selling credits, carbon credits. Is that something that you see coming back in the future?
It depends on a sort of price on carbon. There are those voluntary systems. California, I sort of cut short my talk at the end because I was going over. But California is moving forward quite rapidly on the price on carbon. Alberta, is putting a price on carbon. Other provinces, and I think there are already regional training programs around. So I don't know of the status of that going forward. I don't think they're going to wither and die. But there've been lots of sort of birth pangs, especially in the ETS. Maintaining price where it actually makes sense. Keeping that price high has been a challenge. So I guess the question is, I don't know what will happen to the price on the trading systems. Yeah.
Are there any ways in which the countries are being held responsible for the goals that they set in the
No. It's a voluntary agreement. It's really, when I was there and when they described it, the idea was that let's all do this together, and there's no enforcement mechanism, and that's been criticized by some. Usually the criticism from that comes from the developing countries. The counter argument to that was, well, there was an enforcement mechanism at Kyoto and everyone blew through their emissions limits. I don't think it works. I think what you have to do is sort of create conditions and get, this sort of momentum going and get this sort of this sort of pay it forward mentality going. I think that's the only way that will work. And I think that the developed countries have to do much more in terms of making climate finance available than they have, and to make it available in rational ways. And that's, something that's been lagging behind. But no, enforcement just won't work. It has to be done diplomatically.
In terms of incorporating renewable energy into our current grid, I know it's going to be a challenge for several reasons. One of them because of reliability. How does that work in India?
There's interesting programs. There's this new initiative that's just taking off that's targeting at giving, there's I think about 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity, and there's a whole new initiative to provide electricity to those people, and it's concentrated in Africa and in areas of India, and the idea that people are looking at more and more as modular sort of programs, and the reliability I don't think is as much an issue if you're talking about residential use and uses where there is no electricity. Storage batteries and stuff. There are people who are very optimistic about a new generation of battery storage that will get over that.
Right now, the United States has a president who thinks climate change is a hoax made by Chinese, and
That's right.
also he attacked journalists so many times. You think they're not telling the truth, and you're a journalist and you cover climate change. What do you think of that personally? And also in that atmosphere, do you think that some kind of change the status of environmental journalists?
Well, look, it's quite clear to any rational human being that climate change is not a hoax created by the Chinese, right? That's just a big lie. And it's not even a lie that anyone can believe, right? So, it's just a toss-off line. And it's true that in a few short weeks, that Donald Trump and people in the White House have very regularly attacked journalists. And, it's, the fake media and stuff. And I would argue that actually what you've seen is some of the finest journalism coming out in the last few weeks. Some really great reporting coming out from the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I would say that as journalists, we failed in the campaign. I didn't really cover the campaign, but I'll take the we. We failed in the campaign. We failed in our job to vet politicians, to hold politicians to account, and so that's happening now. And I'd say journalism, I think it is chilling when the President of the United States attacks you by name. And it is damaging when the President of the United States at a press conference calls on 3 fringe right-wing non-mainstream media groups as his only questions. But I think also that, from Washington, I get a sense that people really feel a renewed sense of mission as journalists, and it's an exciting time to be a journalist. So, yeah, sure, you're going to get scared, and it's going to be tough, but I think people really believe in what they're doing. And you're also seeing investment in journalism, which is much needed. And so that's really great. You're seeing Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, making more money available. They're hiring like 50, 60 people. That's unthinkable. The New York Times is putting money in. ProPublica, got a huge infusion of cash. They're hiring about 40 people. Setting up local reporting hubs. That's really encouraging. I think where I would like to see more money for journalism is in the regional areas. I don't need to see it necessarily in New York or in DC. There's tons of journalists there. But what's happening in the States, because I think the States have always been the incubators of policies that come to Washington, and I think, in terms of seeing how those initiatives play out and what play out, I think you need much more accountability at the state level. Who's first? Okay.
How much of an asset or a liability or an obstacle has intellectual property, patent, copyright, all that, has that been in the past in terms of fighting climate change or adapting to climate change? And how much of an obstacle or asset do you see it being in the future?
I can't really speak to that. That's not something I've sort of looked at. I know it is an issue for India generally, but it's not something that I've ever heard discussed sort of in general sort of climate world. I mean, certainly, countries talk about more transfer of technology and stuff like that, and that's not forthcoming, but I haven't heard it addressed explicitly anywhere.
Could you say a bit about how animal agriculture fits into this picture?
In the U.S., well, I mean, as you know that, I forget the numbers. I should be able to rattle them off. But eating beef is, beef and animals are just much more, raising beef and cattle creates much more emissions than raising chickens. And raising chickens creates much more emissions than a vegetarian diet. So the agricultural industry in general, I think, is 9% of U.S. emissions. And I'm not quite sure how much of that is from animal husbandry. But in terms of our food habits, if we want to fight climate change, one very easy way that you can do it at a individual level is don't eat beef, don't eat pork.
Yeah. And I think it ties in with also other countries trying to be like Americans. It's not just trying to have so much energy and technology as Americans. There's also wanting to eat like Americans.
Yeah.
I think in China, it's not just they're increasing coal; they're increasing their animal production as well.
Yes.
And animal production reinforces.
Yeah.
The coal and the oil.
Absolutely.
And everything.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Is there any sense of the U.S. military rising as a possible spokesperson about climate change, both in their dual interest in documenting instability globally that might, be the result of climate change, but also their own energy needs?
Well, the U.S. military has been all over this. I mean, General Mattis is really, I've seen him talk about climate change and threats to security. They're steeped in this. If you go to Guantanamo, which hopefully you won't, or you will and come back, but no. But if you go to Guantanamo, I mean, there's big wind turbines there. I mean, they're trying to run Guantanamo on wind power. They have electric vehicles running around Guantanamo. I mean, so the U.S. military has taken this on board, and they took it on board for a while, but really not, well, for various reasons. I think the first reason was sort of that they realized that troops were being exposed by their need for fossil fuels. So when you had the invasion of Iraq, you had, having to have supply convoys on that long corridor, and the same in Afghanistan, having, convoys just with fuel to fuel up. They were getting hit by IEDs. So there is, the military has been doing really cutting-edge research into making individual Marines, and I think Marines in particular, to be their own sort of power source, and experimenting with vehicles, as solar panels on vehicles or solar backpacks and stuff like that. So they're putting a lot of research into that, but more also, so that's energy security issues. But on a purely climate front, the military also recognizes that they call climate change a force multiplier. And they've identified areas. There are maps that are being done now by academics, but for the under contract for Pentagon that look at areas of instability because of climate change. So it has to do with impacts like sea level rise plus lack of governance. And those maps have already been completed for Africa, and they there's different sort of ways they move them around, and they're looking at Asia as well now.
What do you think the social effects are of when the government, like you mentioned, Obama was creating climate change policy and maybe not using that term? So what do you think that effect is on the general population and their feeling towards climate change?
I think it's become a real. There's been a real problem with climate sort of messaging in this country, and it. If you talk to conservatives, they say, well, Al Gore made it a political issue, which I think isn't the case. You know, Al Gore, seeing Al Gore take up this issue made it a political issue. But remember, the EPA was created by Nixon, right? I mean, environmental issue has been one of those issues that had been previously been sort of nonpartisan, but it's been caught up in politics, and the language has been really tricky. The framing has been really tricky. And I think it sort of confuses the issue when you don't talk about climate change. You don't talk about the need to do something about climate. Like if I talk about clean energy jobs, where's the urgency? You know, if I talk about green jobs, where's the urgency? You know?
And how do you think journalists can shape that narrative? Because I know it's hard. I'm a journalism student, and it's oftentimes you want to use different phrasing than policymakers.
I think use climate change, but I think the thing that I found that worked for me as a journalist is when I made it a human story. I didn't, you know, it's the same as writing any story. It's just making it connect to humans, telling it how it affected humans. You know, one of the stories that I did that did really well in terms of traffic is I actually wrote about the Iditarod and how the effect it had on, you know, when you run dogs in extreme temperatures, their pads get damaged. They actually, the meat that had been left out on the trail for them spoiled. In Alaska, it was so hot. They threw up because they were running so hard in the heat and stuff, and the track was bumpy. You know, if you tell those stories, you know, and just in a descriptive way and an immediate way, I think that makes an impact. Also, if you talk about some of the numbers, you know, some of those numbers are quite stunning. You look at it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and thanks everyone for coming. Let's continue the conversation, and I will create the reception.